Anyways, good morning. Glad to have you guys with us this morning as we continue our Advent series and celebrating the birth of Christ. And we're doing it a unique way during this time because instead of going through the birth story of Jesus, we're going through the prequel, what led up to Jesus being born. Why did Jesus need to leave his throne in heaven and come down to earth to be born as a child, lowly in a manger? Why did Jesus put on humanity to come to reconcile, to rescue, and to redeem his people? And we see that through the genealogy of Matthew, that this is how Jesus had chosen to come to this earth. And so as we're remembering our video in our series called Sacred Scandal, we're remembering that when God made us and he created this world, he created us good. He created each of us good, and as far as his creation and humanity, he even would use the words very good. But as we know through the Genesis account, sin entered the world. And like that Christmas tree of beauty is thrown upon the fire, all of the world had entered into sin, has entered into death and destruction, and we're all around us in a fallen and broken world where there's pain and there's suffering, there's diseases, there's heartache, there's tears, and so forth. And we're looking forward to the day when there will be no more pain, no more sorrow, no more heartache. But until then, we're living in those years in between. And so how do we do that? How do we go about living in this world and what it is that we see around us? And in that video, we saw how that tree, burnt and broken, is adorned with the beauty of the lights and the ornaments, and how we are adorned with that same beauty of Jesus, because he has come into our hearts. He has opened our eyes. He has given us hope. He's given us purpose. He has given us reason. Sacred, if remember last week we talked about sacred being God ordained, or something that God has decreed. This is something that is sacred. And scandal is something that is morally or legally wrong and appalling and causes great outrage. And so how could God have ordained something that was morally wrong or legally wrong and causes great outrage? Well, we see here that the family Jesus came from is the family that Jesus came for. And so as we look through the genealogy of Jesus and as we look through the beginnings that led to the Christmas story, we've recognized that there's 5 women that are listed in here in the genealogy. And we're looking through these 5 services, each of the women of the genealogy. So we're going to start in Matthew 1, and then we'll jump back to the Old Testament. But in Matthew 1, we have a very neglected piece of Scripture. And I was joking with our setup team earlier today. I was like, I'm excited to read through this because I just never read through this part. It's like there's nothing fun and exciting to read through. There's no narrative. There's nothing dramatic happening. But through this, we're seeing that there's so much beauty to be had in here because this is the family and the people that Jesus came through. So Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, and Tamar. Now remember last week when we talked about Tamar, and Tamar was married off to the sons of Judah. But then his first son, did something that we're not told in Scripture, but was so evil that God decided that he would kill him on the spot. And so here's Tamar without an heir, without a child. And so Tamar was then given to the next oldest son, Onan. And then Odin decided he did not want to fulfill his duties as a brother and did not want to fulfill his duties as continuing the heir line of his brother, and the Lord killed him. And then we're seeing the drama unfold through Tamar. And then during that time, we see that Judah, who should have given Tamar to his youngest son, decides not to because he's afraid his youngest son's going to die. And then Tamar dresses up as a prostitute, seduces Judah, has a child, and the heir continues. And we hear that story, and we're just like, how messed up could this family be? And then we realize that as we look at families all around the world, and maybe even ourselves, like, oh, we've got a pretty messed up family too. But Jesus worked through that. We see here in Matthew that Jesus actually came from that lineage of broken and messed up families who did not honor God, who did not do what they were told to. And it is through the grace of God and it is through his providence and sovereign will that he has made a way for him to be born through the broken and through the busted up people. And Perez, continuing on, the father of Hezron, and Hezron, the father of Ram, and Ram, the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of Salmon, and Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Now, some of you may have remembered the story of Boaz. And so next week, we get to journey through the story of Ruth, because Ruth is going to come through there. And at least that gives me a little bit of a breather, because then after that, we go through Bathsheba. And then on Christmas Eve, I am going to attempt to say all of these names as we get to the birth of Jesus through Mary. And that's kind of the road path that we're going to head. But today, we're going to journey through the story of Rahab. And before we get into that, there's two things that I want us to kind of keep in mind as we're journeying through this narrative. One of the things that, as we're reading through this, I hope that you see is God is sovereign. What does sovereign mean? Sovereign means that God is in control. God has a plan. Nothing can thwart God's plan. So nothing that I can do, nothing that you guys can do, nothing that this town can do, nothing that anybody here is capable of doing that will be able to stop God's plan from coming through. And we're going to see that through the story this morning. And finally, we're going to see that faith is celebrated. We are all called to have faith. We're going to find out later today that Jesus is the author and finisher of that faith. And through that faith, that it is celebrated, because it is through our faith that we get to participate in what God is doing. And so let's go ahead and journey to where we're camping out today. We're going to be in the book of Joshua, which is right after the Pentateuch, so right after Deuteronomy. So we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua. And so Joshua begins, as you guys are turning there, I'll just give you some backstory. So Moses, many of you have heard of Moses. Moses rescues the people from Israel. They journey through the wilderness. They're stuck in the wilderness for a long time. There's Mount Sinai. God gives the laws to his people. They are given, the Levites are taking care of the temple, the tent of meeting. They are continuing to go through all of the sanctification process as they are coming towards the promised land that God has promised them. And so they're continuing on going through that. And then Moses, dealing with these people who are just like us, who do boneheaded things, say boneheaded things, have wrong actions all the time. Moses, in a fit of anger, strikes a rock to get water to come out of it. Water does come out of it, but disobeys God. And God tells Moses that he will not enter the promised land. And so they're right on the cusp, right on the edge of entering into the land that God has prepared for them. They've been rescued out of Egypt, but Moses is not going to make it. And so Moses passes away, and then the baton, so to speak, is then handed off to Joshua. And now Joshua is the man that is going to go in to the promised land and is going to claim this area, drive out the people in that inhabitants that are haters of the one true God. And he is going to establish his people in that area that is then going to be a light to the rest of the world about who God is. And so that's what's happening in the beginning of Joshua. And so Joshua gets ready. He's heading towards that area. First town he's going to come across is going to be Jericho. Chapter 2, verse 1 is where we're going to begin this morning. And Joshua, the son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim and spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and they lodged there. So Joshua, on the other side of the river, sends 2 spies to go and to look out that land area. So what Joshua wants to do is he's trying to get a strategic understanding of the land that's before them and how he's going to be able to attack this town that God has commissioned him and called him to go do. So he goes forward and he sends 2 spies to go in. Now, these 2 spies had one job, and that job was to find any weaknesses, to find where their strengths are, and to find out, so how are they going to go about this? But while they were in there, they come to a house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. Now, we're not given much information here. We don't know if these spies went into the town, found a brothel, met Rahab, was talking to them, and was invited back to her home. We're not given that type of information. But what we are given is that Rahab came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. So we feel that this person, as different commentaries and different studies of history show, is that this may have been someone of greater honor from the standpoint as she had her own house. So she may have been the head of the brothel. She may have ran the brothel. She may have been the one to organize those type of activities in Jericho, being that she has her own place to stay in. This is what we can look at God's word and try to understand, but we're really not given that much information. And then verse 2 begins. And it was told to the king of Jericho, "Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land." Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you and who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." So the king hears about these 2 Israelites that have made their way into the city. Word is spreading. Something's happening. The king of Jericho, who would have been held up in the likeliness of a god himself, like a demigod, which reminds me of Moana, if we're thinking about Disney movies within this idea of who that character was. But they would be looking at this king as someone of great authority in that area. And so the king goes in and says, "Hey, I have been told, word has got out that these 2 spies have come in. We need to find them right now." And so verse 4, "But the woman, Rahab, had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, 'True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from.' I did not know where they were from. When the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. And I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them, and on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers have gone out. So basically what happened is they came for these 2 spies, and Rahab lied. Rahab said, "Okay, well, I don't know where these men are. They have gone out." And a lot of times we can get caught up on the fact that, oh, well, Rahab lied here. Well, we're not supposed to lie. Well, we're not supposed to do that. Well, that's not the point of the story. And many times in our dealings and everything, we forget in reading Scripture, we can find things that's not the point. It's not the purpose. And so the purpose and the point isn't that Rahab lied during this, is that even though this is going on, God is still sovereign and makes a way for this to happen. And so verse 8, "Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men," and this is where, for me, it gets really good, I know, so this is Rahab speaking, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. So before we get to verse 10, so Rahab is coming to these two spies. She knows that they're Israelites, and she is basically saying, look, I know who you guys are, and frankly, everybody around here knows who you guys are. We have great fear because of who you guys are. Now let's see why that fear is. Verse 10, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before when you came out of Egypt. So Rahab tells the two spies, we know, Jericho, the people of Jericho, we know when you guys crossed the Red Sea and the sea was parted and the Egyptians who followed you fell into the sea and all died. We know that. At the time of this, that would have been 40 years ago. So Rahab would have known that story was such a profound thing that the people in Jericho, way away from Egypt, would have realized that this event happened. And so as the people of Jericho are seeing the camp of Israel across the river, they're saying, hey, that's them. That's those people who this had happened to and who their God has rescued. And so after verse 10, so we have heard that. And then it continues on. And we also heard what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. These were two kings and two battles that the Israelites had, that the Israelites should not have won this battle. If you think about it, remember, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. They were not armies. They were not anything amazing or spectacular. These were the people group that spent their days slaving over what the Pharaoh had asked them to do. And then Moses came, said, let my people go. They escaped out of the clutches of Pharaoh, went through the Red Sea, and continued on. And again, these are not the most trained, elite, armed forces in the time of the land. But God, through his sovereign might and his perfect will, led the troops and the people of Israel to defeat armies and kings that they should never have been able to do. And word got out to Jericho, and Rahab was very familiar during this time. And it's like, we know what you did when you came out of Egypt, and you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to the Sihon and Og, who you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. That's incredible. So word had got to them, and this whole town now, all of Jericho, would have been gripped by fear at the fact that these people who makes no sense at all have been coming and now are on the cusp of being at Jericho. And everybody's scared and everybody's afraid, including this prostitute, Rahab. And then look what she says next. So the beginning part is she's confessing the power and the strength of who God is. She's confessing her fear of what is about to happen. And then she says in verse 11, make sure I'm missing here. We'll just do verse 11 again. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. There was no spirit left in any man because of you, for the Lord our God. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's do this again. And there was no spirit left in any man because of you. And now this is the part I want us to make sure we listen to closely. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. This was Rahab confessing to the two Israelites who God is. It's one thing for us as a people group, taking it back to our modern time, it's one thing for us to believe that God exists. Many people here in Champions Gate and Four Corners and Davenport and Wrong, many people believe God exists. And so that's a reality. And many of us think, well, as long as they know that God exists and they believe in God, that's okay. But there needs to be a step further. The Bible tells us to go further. And here Rahab does that. She goes further. She's like, I don't just know that this is your God doing this, but who is this? For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Verse 12, Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with me and my father's house. And give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death." And so she has confessed who these people are. She has given the praise and honor to the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, to Yahweh, the Father. He has said that this is what is going to happen. He has preordained this to happen. And now Rahab realizes that, confesses, and proclaims the Father exactly who he is. And then what happens here in verse 14. "And the men said to her, 'Our lives for yours, even to death.'" So now the men are like, "Hey, we're going to do this. So our lives for yours, even until death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us this land, we will deal kindly with you." Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was built into the city wall. So that's kind of neat. And so that she lived in the wall. Verse 16. "And she said to them, 'Go into the hills, or the pursuers will encounter you, and hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Then afterward you may go your way.' The men said to her, 'We will be guiltless with respect to this oath of yours that you have made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, you shall tie the scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. You shall gather into your house your father and mother and brothers and all of your father's household. Then if anyone goes out the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we shall be guiltless. But if a hand is laid on anyone who is within you or with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be guiltless with respect to your oath that you have made us swear.' And she said, 'According to your words,'" so this is Rahab, "'according to your words, so be it.' Then she sent them away and departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window." I'm going to pause there for just a second. Scarlet cord. Scarlet cord would be red, correct? That's the color of scarlet. This was something that I did not catch until my time studying this. These were the Israelites. I think this is really profound, so I hope you stay with me through this. The Israelites had just left Egypt. During Egypt, they had a time of Passover. During the Passover, they would take and slaughter a lamb, and they would put it over the doorway of their home. And because of that, the angel of death would see that and would pass over that house, and the firstborn son would be spared from every house that was on. And so the Israelites celebrate Passover. The Jews continue to celebrate Passover to this very day. We as Christians should celebrate the passing over and how God saved the children of the firstborn of Israel during that day, and then also how he destroyed the firstborn of Pharaoh and all of the Egyptians. So the color of red would have been something very important. I think what is so profound here is that the spies chose to put a color of red on this as they come down, symbolizing that they too are now going to pass over that particular spot as they come for Jericho. And that was a profound thought when I thought about that, how God protects his people, how God uses the color red to constantly be reminding us over and over about who he is, what he has done for us through Passover, through the scarlet cord that's wrapped around the rope, and one day again we will see, as we talk about through the birth of Jesus, we're going to see now his blood, Jesus himself, that was poured out for us. And so the scarlet cord, as we look at it, may seem insignificant, but for the Israelites, this would mean everything. And so when they're talking about giving their oath, that they trust that they are going to do this, when they see that scarlet cord, they're going to know the same thing that happened for them in Passover, now they're going to extend to Rahab. Verse 22. They departed and went into the hills and remained there 3 days until the pursuers returned. And the pursuers searched all along the way and found nothing. Then the two men returned. They came down from the hills. They passed over and came to Joshua, the son of Nun, and they told him all that had happened to them. And they said to Joshua, truly the Lord has given all of the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. And so that's the story of Rahab. It seems very odd, seems very interesting that this would be somebody that God would put in the lineage of Jesus. So what is so profound and amazing about this story? Well, one, that God is sovereign, that God has ordained what he is going to have happen, and that we get to trust that because God has done so, and we are his children, that we don't need to worry or stress or fear anything that happens in this life, because God has it all under control. And two, that we see God opening the eyes and the heart of Rahab to do something that helps continue that, where anything could have gone to thwart this mission, but God in his sovereign grace and mercy uses one of the people that you'd probably least think in all of Jericho that the holy and righteous God would use, has chosen to use Rahab. And then after that, for a few chapters, she disappears, and we don't hear from her again until chapter 6. So turn a couple of pages to chapter 6, and we're going to pick up in chapter 6, verse 22, and we're going to see Rahab re-enter the story. Verse 22 of chapter 6, but the two men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her. And you swore to her. So this is Joshua telling those two spies, now go and do this. So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. And they brought all of her relatives and put them outside of the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire and everything in it, only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put in the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab, the prostitute, and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers from Joshua and sent the spy out of Jericho. And so we see Rahab come back into the story, and she was rescued, she was saved, and she was camped outside of Israel during that time. And at the writing of the book of Joshua, they're writing this after the fact that it happened. It says, hey, Rahab is still with us, even at the writing of the book of Joshua. Then after that, Rahab disappears. We don't see her anymore until the New Testament. In the New Testament, we see in Hebrews as well as in James. So if you'd like to, you're welcome to turn to James. It's chapter 2, verse 25. But I'm here and I'll read it to you. So in James chapter 2, verse 25, it says, so right before the verse before 24, it says, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by her works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? Even though James uses the word prostitute here, he's still saying, look at what Rahab did. Rahab was obedient. Rahab participated in God's story here. And it's looked upon as a positive thing. Yes, he uses the word prostitute, but it's looking on as a positive thing. And then in Hebrews chapter 11, which is just the book before, so in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 says this. I'm going to jump around here a little bit, but verse 8 in Hebrews chapter 11 says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called out to go to that place that he was to receive an inheritance. Verse 17, as we skip down, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. Verse 29, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea as onto dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, verse 31, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. And so we see this amazing grace being given out to those for their faith. But check this out. In chapter 12, verse 1, it says this, as we continue through Hebrews. It says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely to us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith." So the author of Hebrews goes through recounting all of these great acts of faith that people have done, that Abraham has done, that Isaac, that Rahab, and goes through all these different people of faith. And then in the very next chapter says, looking to Jesus, who is the founder and perfecter of our faith. So even if we had any sense of arrogance about look what we get to do and look who we are, look how much faith I have, we find that Jesus is the author. Jesus is the one that founds our faith, and Jesus is the one that perfects our faith. But Rahab is listed in this as one of those who had great faith. How amazing is that? Well, that's the story that we have of Rahab. But one thing that I found really neat and how this can tie to the Christmas message is this. And it doesn't really seem like, man, you're hitting a home run with this Christmas. I feel all jolly and I'm ready to go sing carols out as we're going and working through this. But listen to the beauty of this. In chapter 6, Rahab was rescued and saved and camped outside of Israel. And so outside the camp, after the walls of Jericho came down, Rahab was out there. And so I was pondering this week, so what would have Rahab had to have done to get into now the camp of Israel? Because in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through the genealogy, we see that Rahab ends up marrying Solomon, who is in the line of Judah and the line of David and would be the line that Jesus would come from. So how did that happen? How did Rahab, a prostitute on the outskirts of the camp, because she is not ritually clean or pure, she is not an Israelite, how did she become into the fold of the line of Judah? And we realize as going through and studying these type of understanding is that, first of all of the men in the house of Rahab would have had to be circumcised. And so it shows us that even though it doesn't say this, that those people were obedient. The house of Rahab was obedient, being circumcised. But then Rahab would have also had to have been obedient and had confessed her sins and would have to give a sin sacrifice. Sin sacrifices were done through goats, rams, as well as lambs. And so it doesn't say what Rahab would have done, but we know through the history and the Levitical laws and everything, Rahab would have had to come and present an offering and a sacrifice. And so we see that through Matthew chapter 1, that sacrifice was accepted and that she was then welcomed into the camp of Israel. And so it may not have been a lamb. It may have been a lamb. But the idea that she would come in and have to give a sacrifice, and she would be used through the line of Judah, through the line of David, to bring forth the perfect lamb, Jesus. And that as she would go in and make a sacrifice, as she would carry the shame and weight, as she's understanding who a righteous and holy God is and how she rejected him for almost her entire life until the spies came in and God opened up her mind and heart to who they were and used her to continue bringing out his plan, he has found favor with her and she has then given her life over and sacrificed. But sacrifices would continue throughout the whole line of Israel. Sacrifices would continue to have because the people of Israel would continue to sin. And the whole Old Testament, as I've said before, is one word can be summed up in anticipation. Anticipation of the lamb that would be slain, that would then no longer need to be any more sacrifices. The once and for all defeater of sin would come. And that's the Christmas story. That's why Jesus came. He came through the fallen, through the broken, the family that you would say, yeah, this is not a family that I would want to be a part of, is the exact family that Jesus came to save. And so as we look around and take a moment to even look around this room, we can see that each one of us are a part of the family that Jesus has come to save. The reason he was born in a manger, the reason why he was raised up to put himself on a cross, to take the pain and the suffering, the whips and the crown of thorns and everything that happened to him, the nails into his hand, was something that he did willingly for us to be the final. and the complete and the only sacrifice that we will ever need. And so as we think about the Christmas story, it's so easy for us to think about the beauty of the Charlie Brown Christmas and the beauty of family and the beauty of everything that comes around us and the happiness that comes. And I want so much for you guys to experience that happiness. But if we don't remember why Jesus came, then that happiness is going to be short-lived, because we're going to remind ourselves again of our fallen and brokenness. We'll remind ourselves, because of this world and because of the enemy, we're going to be reminded of our sin and our shame. But when we remember the fullness of the birth story of Jesus, we remember that he came for each and every one of us, for us. So let's pray.